Greetings. Few things attract press coverage like a strong tropical storm. We also hear that the numbers and/or the strength of them is increasing, but without actually seeing the long-term numbers. In this video, we will look at those numbers up to 2018. The problem with the data on tropical storms is that we have different eras in which the means available to observe and measure them were different. Originally, people on the ground, and in some cases ships, would record the presence and intensity of a storm with whatever means were available. In the 20th century, aircraft, water buoys, balloons, and radiometeographs were being used by the 1930s, and radar was available by the 1940s, but not at the same time and regularity across the different regions. By the 1960s, weather satellites which could potentially monitor every storm became available. World coverage by weather satellites is often said to be in place by 1970, but this date is arbitrary. By 1977, the number and sophistication of geostationary satellites assured worldwide detection and monitoring of almost all tropical storms. However, the measurement of storm strength is constantly being refined. Measurements made in the 70s and 80s are not as precise or complete as those made today. This means there is good evidence that before 1970 at least, and certainly before 1940, there were storms that were either not officially recorded or were not measured as full cyclonic storms. Exactly how incomplete and how inaccurate this earlier data was is probably impossible to say with certainty. Bearing all this in mind, we will show the number of cyclonic tropical storms and severe cyclonic storms in the various regions starting with 1970, and will also show some numbers from earlier years. We start with a region many are not familiar with, the Southwest Indian Ocean. This refers to cyclones that form in the Indian Ocean south of the equator and move toward Africa. In this region, 100% complete coverage by satellites was only available in 1998. The chart shows that the total number of cyclones dropped to a low in the mid-1970s, then rose to a level equal to the earlier highs by 2003. The number of severe cyclones was higher by 2002 than in the 1970s, but it has since leveled off. Northern Indian cyclones originate in the Bay of Bengal or the Arabian Sea. The number of cyclones and severe cyclones dropped by the end of the 1970s, and since then the numbers have leveled off to an average of approximately 4 cyclones and 2.3 severe cyclones per year. The records for North Indian Ocean cyclones go back into the 1800s. Despite the less effective methods for measurement in the earlier years, we see that the numbers recently are considerably lower than they were in 1890 to 1945 and 1960 to 1980. Australian region cyclones are those originating in the southern Indian Ocean from 90 degrees east to 160 degrees east in the Southwest Pacific. Within this area, the number of both cyclones and severe cyclones has slowly declined since the 1970s. South Pacific cyclones are those occurring in the southern Pacific Ocean between 160 degrees east and 120 degrees west. Despite occurring in the Pacific, these are referred to as cyclones. The number of these has recently declined by about 25% from the 1970s and 80s. The number of severe cyclones rose from the 1970s to the 1980s, but has since declined back to an average of approximately 3 per year. In the Northwest Pacific, the number of typhoons has declined from an average of just over 15 per year to an average of 12 per year. At the same time, the average number of severe typhoons has increased from 3.4 to 5.1. Using data going back to 1950, we see the late 1950s and early 1960s with a significant peak in both typhoons and severe typhoons that exceeds the levels seen since. In the Eastern Pacific, we speak in terms of hurricanes. Here we see a rise in the average number of both hurricanes and severe hurricanes from the 1970s until the 1990s. There was a noticeable decline to a lower level through 2010. This has been followed by a return to the numbers seen in the 1990s. Atlantic hurricane numbers rose significantly from the early 1970s until 2006. Since then, levels have declined somewhat, but not to the lower levels of the 1970s. As is so often the case, looking at what happened before the start of the graph is instructive, as we see that the levels in the 1970s and 80s were lower than in the 1950s and 60s. What is remarkable in the long-term data is what looks like a 60-year cycle. We see a peak in the 5-year moving average around 1890, another in the 1950s, and another in 2006. Again, it is unfortunate that we cannot tell by how much the older data underestimates the number and perhaps strength of hurricanes at that time. Totaling all the regions, we see a decrease in the average number of cyclonic storms from between 60 and 70 to between 50 and 60 per year since the 1970s. The average number of severe cyclonic storms has oscillated between 20 and 30. Presently, it has returned to the upper end of that range. 4 of 7 regions have seen a decrease in the average number of cyclone-level tropical storms since the 1970s. The total number across all regions has declined by 13.4%. This decline seems to have leveled off over the last 20 years. Overall, this means 8 fewer such storms per year now than in the 1970s. 5 of 7 regions have seen an increase in the average number of severe cyclone-level storms since the 1970s. This amounts to an overall increase of 13%, which translates to just over 2 more such storms per year worldwide. One wonders if this difference is a function of the ever-increasing sophistication in the measurement of tropical storm strength. The pattern is uneven since there are actually slightly fewer now than in the 1990s. The long-term data, although imperfect for reasons discussed earlier, does suggest cycles in the number of cyclonic and severe cyclonic storms. Some of these earlier cycles reached high levels that have not been repeated since. This data is publicly available. You could look it up for yourself very easily. As always, I have to ask, have you seen this data before? If the answer is no, why is that? If strong tropical storms are so newsworthy and important, why isn't their history equally so? Thank you for watching.